Life is full of unexpected twists and turns. Some good, some bad, some simply beyond this realm. The tales you are about to hear are the untold stories of those who entered the shadows, perhaps against their own will. These are the Terror Tapes. Terror Tapes, Episode 7. The Forest Comes Alive. The fire crackled as Dan watched the flames dance among themselves, sending him into a mesmerized trance as he played with a Swiss Army knife with his name engraved on the side. A gift from his grandfather, who always encouraged Dan to live life. "Careful, City Slicker. They'll burn your eyes out before the trip's even over," Lone Wolf said to Dan as they sat around the campfire. It was all too surreal to Dan. To think it was just yesterday he impulsively booked the trip, and now he was hiking and camping among the trees of the Tillamook Forest with some moderately rated and rather boastful guide he found online. No one at the office will believe the story, especially coming from Dan, the office hermit. Dan liked proving them wrong, though, that he wasn't just some recluse. Damn them and their assumptions. Lone Wolf leaned in with a serious look. "You ever hear the legend of the Rotwood Raiders?" Dan shook his head. "Hundreds of years ago, a pirate ship wrecked on the coast. The survivors, Captain Dreadwood and his crew, were bloodthirsty bastards. They raided settlements, killed anyone they came across until one night they crossed the wrong woman, a witch. She cursed them to remain in the forest forever. To this day, folks say you can hear them in the trees, still hunting, still raiding." A gust of wind rustled through the branches. Somewhere in the darkness, something cracked. Then another sound, a ragged cough followed by a low hoarse chuckle. Dan shot up straight. Lone Wolf waved him off, laughing. "Just the wind." After a restless night of sleep on the cold, hard ground, the type of bed Dan isn't used to, he was awoken by raindrops bouncing off his head and an unsettling discovery. A skull and crossbones carved deep into a tree by their camp. It looked like it was finger-painted with blood highlighting the skull. "Drunk rednecks," Lone Wolf grumbled. "Happens all the time." Dan could sense an uncertainty in Lone Wolf's voice. They pressed on, but unease settled deep in Dan's gut, and the trail muddied from the persistent rain. Despite the worsening conditions, Dan was still enjoying the new adventure. To date, this was the most adventurous thing he'd ever done. As they continued, Dan couldn't help but see things moving around him, but he wasn't sure if it was the forest or his eyes playing tricks on him. "The forest is alive. Happens all the time. This trail ain't nothing to the hills I've ventured," Lone Wolf shouted over the pouring rain. Even beyond Lone Wolf's brazenness, Dan still carried on with a smile. Then, all of his fun and excitement came to a drastic halt when they pushed through some thick bushes into a clearing. They stood in shock as they looked at an X marked on the ground, made of dead woodland critters, their bodies twisted unnaturally and guts spilled out. Then, the forest truly sprung to life. The ground started to shake under their feet. The grass began rapidly waving and expanding. Vines shot from the undergrowth, wrapping around their limbs, yanking them off their feet. The trees groaned as figures emerged from the shadows. Grotesque humanoid forms of gnarled bark, moss-covered limbs, and empty, hollowed-out eyes. The Rotwood Raiders had found them. Captain Dreadwood loomed over them, his form a terrible fusion of man and tree draped in rotting pirate garb. He walked with a log where there would be a peg, and sitting on his shoulder was a small bird-like animal made of vines and bushes for feathers. "You trespass on hallowed ground," he rumbled. "Now you belong to the forest, which means—" "We didn't trespass on shit," Lone Wolf interrupted, but Captain Dreadwood paid him no attention. "You belong to me," he said, then snapped his fingers. The two new captives were carried away in the vines with the rest of the pirate crew. Dragged back to their camp, the two men were bound and tormented by the crew. Dreadwood and Lone Wolf clashed instantly, Lone Wolf's arrogance met with the captain's indifference. "There's no way a bunch of trees are taking me hostage," Lone Wolf snapped, but was swiftly met by a branch punching him in the gut out of nowhere, forcing him to drop to his knees. "Hostage? You'd wish to be a hostage. It'd mean you might get out of here. The trees don't own you. I do." Captain Dreadwood barks back. "Start by clearing out the dead leaves. They make a perfect kindling, not something we keep around here." Captain Dreadwood starts to walk away. "I think I'll pass." Lone Wolf says as he stands back up and Dan's stomach drops to his feet. Captain Dreadwood suddenly vanishes and reappears directly in front of Lone Wolf, standing eye to rotten eye. Dreadwood's stare cuts right through Lone Wolf, whose face is pale white with glazed over eyes. He looks like a human possum playing dead on his feet. "Yeah? And what exactly do you bring to my crew?" Captain Dreadwood asks. Survivalist? Lone Wolf says, fumbling with his words. "Oh, survivalist. Then your keen survival instinct should be kicking in. Or perhaps there is something you're not sharing with us, Mr. Lone Wolf doesn't respond. "Your name, son." Captain Dreadwood snaps at Lone Wolf, then picks him up by the throat, using vines without lifting his hand. "Gavin McTinney," Lone Wolf barely spits out. Dan shot a look at Lone Wolf, or Gavin, of complete disbelief. "Gavin? You said your name was Lone Wolf. Are you even a survivalist?" Dan shouted. Captain Dreadwood smugly smiled as he dropped Gavin's body on the ground, and the crew laughed at him as he tried to regain his breath. "Excellent question. What is it you offer me and my crew, survivalist extraordinaire? Or is that also a lie, too?" Captain Dreadwood asked as he stood over Gavin. Gavin didn't answer, or get up this time. He lay on the ground, staring down. "You best prove your worth to me and me crew, or you might as well walk the plank," Captain Dreadwood said, then turned his gaze to the edge of the nearby cliff. Gavin watched as the ocean's aggressive and thunderous smack collided with the cliffside and shook the ground under them. Gavin slowly stood up, but didn't raise his gaze, still staring down. He turned toward the cliffside, and then, before Dan realized it, Gavin stepped off and disappeared. Captain Dreadwood, Dan, and the crew waited as the silent moment passed, followed by a faint, crunching splat only moments later. Dan recoiled. "You didn't have to do that!" "And you don't have to live," Dreadwood said, vines wrapping around Dan's throat. "He was nothing, he knew it. There's no room for that amongst me crew. Now you best get to work or else you'll be following Mr. McTinney," Captain Dreadwood said as he stormed off, and then the vines wrapped around Dan's body shot across the pirates' crew's campground into a prison cell made of a hollow tree, with the other end being a cliff. Dan's body rolled right to the edge of the cliffside before he stopped himself. He lay in agonizing pain from the impact of the throws, as the vines were still wrapped around him. He could feel the vines squeezing tighter the more he squirmed, and struggled before he eventually passed out. Dan came through a few hours later into the night. He felt in his pocket that he still had his Swiss Army knife. He was able to pull out the main blade and start slowly but steadily sawing his way through the many layers of vines wrapped around him. He was making good progress when the cell door shot off and Captain Dreadwood appeared. Dan was barely able to slip his knife away. Captain Dreadwood stood on the cliff's edge, watching as the waves danced and the caps were highlighted by the moonlight. "State your name," he said without turning around. "Dan, look, I said your name, not an explanation," Captain Dreadwood said. "What is it you seek on my territory, Dan?" he asked. Tears started to well up in Dan's eyes. I don't know." Captain Dreadwood whipped around. "A man without a mission is a dangerous path. That's how he ends up in a place like this." "I just wanted something more, I guess," Dan said. Captain Dreadwood walks back over to the edge of the cliff and stares off. Dan can see something in Dreadwood's face that tells him that Dreadwood understood what Dan meant. Dan slowly started to slip the vines wrapped around his body off. "You don't seem content," Dan said as he began creeping out the open cell door. Dreadwood continued staring off. "We all want more, Dan. It seems no one is content with their life, yet you venture out only to find yourself wanting what you once had," Captain Dreadwood said. "It's a vicious cycle, life that is." Before Dreadwood realized it, Dan was out the door and running as fast as his legs would carry him in any direction. As he ran, he saw a faint illumination ahead and busted through some bushes to find himself at a campsite of a bunch of drunk rednecks deep into a few bottles of whiskey, spraying lighter fluid into their campfire. "Jesus Christ, help me!" Dan gasped. The men barely had time to register him before the Rotwood Raiders descended and attacked the group of rednecks. The drunken rednecks fired their guns wildly, but it was no use. The pirates slaughtered them, ripping them apart like wolves in a henhouse. Dan, in a final act of defiance, kicked the campfire, sending embers flying and squeezed the lighter fluid everywhere. The forest ignited instantly and the flames spread fast. The raiders howled as fire consumed them, their bodies crackling and splitting. As the fire grew, Dan felt the heat searing in his skin. He turned and ran toward the cliff, toward the sea. He jumped, not thinking about what was at the bottom. Either the sea would catch him and carry him away, or he'd die. Both were options he'd rather than being a part of Dreadwood's crew. As he was in the air, he felt free. It was the first time he'd ever tasted the ocean's salt as some waves reached up to grab him. But just before he plummeted into the dark sea below him, he felt something wrap around his ankles and yank him backwards. A vine shot up, dragging him back onto the burning land. Dan gasped, coughing smoke and staring up at Captain Dreadwood's charred, splintering form. Some of his face smoldering from the fire, and Dan looked down at his own arm, which was partially on fire. "Like I told you," the captain rasped. "We all want what we had." Dan screamed as the vines tore through his skin, roots burrowing deep, twisting his flesh into bark. His veins turned to sap, and his fingers blackened into clawed twigs. The last thing he saw before his eyes hollowed into the darkness was the ocean, so close, yet forever out of reach. Then, not only did he belong to the forest, he was part of it. And that concludes another journey into the dark world of the Terror Tapes. If you enjoyed the terror, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join our growing legion of fear seekers, and together we'll explore the darkest corners of the unknown. Until next time, stay haunted.